The sea was black glass. No moon hung overhead, only the indifferent stars scattered across the Pacific sky like shards of broken promise. The air tasted of salt and rust, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of fuel oil from dozens of vessels slicing through the darkness. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser Hiei, Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe stood rigid, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. His fleet, 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers, moved in perfect formation, a steel serpent gliding through the void. They were invisible, unseen, masters of the night. Abe believed this absolutely. For centuries, Japanese naval doctrine had revered night combat as the ultimate expression of warrior spirit, seishin, where human courage and training triumphed over mechanical dependence. The Americans, Abe had been told, were soft. They relied on gadgets and machines, electrical toys that glowed in the dark. Radar, the word itself was spoken with contempt in the wardrooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a crutch for men who lacked the discipline to fight with their eyes and their instincts. Abe's captains had laughed about it over sake and cigarettes. What good was a machine that saw in the dark when the samurai spirit needed no light to strike? But on this night, in these waters, something was watching them. 13 miles away, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force steamed directly toward Abe's ships. The American vessels were outnumbered, outgunned, and led by a man who had never commanded a surface action in his life. But they possessed something the Japanese did not. Eyes that pierced the darkness. Eyes made not of flesh, but of electromagnetic waves bouncing off steel hulls and returning as glowing dots on a cathode screen. The cruiser Helena had picked up Abe's fleet at 1:24 a.m., 27,000 yards distant. The Japanese had no idea they had been seen, and that ignorance would cost them everything. To understand how the Imperial Japanese Navy arrived at this moment, blind, mocked by their own arrogance, one must go back years before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. The story begins not with radar itself, but with a philosophy, a belief system woven into the fabric of Japanese naval identity. Since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, when Admiral Togo Heihachiro crossed the T at Tsushima and annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, the Imperial Navy had venerated the decisive surface engagement. Victory, they believed, came from superior spirit, rigorous training, and the willingness to die without hesitation. Technology was secondary. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was eternal. When American and British engineers began experimenting with radio detection systems in the late 1930s, Japanese naval intelligence reports filtered back to Tokyo. The assessments were dismissive. Radar was bulky, unreliable, prone to interference. It required constant calibration and trained operators. Worse, it represented a dependency, a reliance on machines rather than men. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the theoretical value of radar, but he was a lonely voice. Most of his peers saw it as beneath them, and Western obsession with comfort and safety. Japanese destroyers practiced night torpedo runs until their crews could execute them blindfolded. Lookouts trained their eyes for hours in pitch darkness, learning to detect the faint phosphorescence of a ship's wake, the shadow of a distant mast against the stars. This was the Japanese way. This was superiority. By 1942, American shipyards were churning out vessels equipped with SG surface search radar and fire control radar sets that could calculate range, bearing, and speed with terrifying precision. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, had developed primitive radar systems of their own, but they were treated as experimental curiosities installed on only a handful of ships and rarely trusted in combat. Captains preferred their binoculars, commanders preferred their instincts, and so as the war ground into its second year, a fatal gap opened between perception and reality. The Japanese Navy believed it owned the night. The Americans were learning to see through it. The men aboard Abe's ships expected a slaughter. They had been briefed on their mission: bombard Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, destroy the American aircraft stationed there, and pave the way for troop reinforcements. The American Navy, they were told, was scattered and demoralized after months of brutal attrition in the Solomons. If the Americans even dared to intercept, they would be crushed in a quick, decisive night action, the kind of battle Japanese sailors had trained their entire lives to win. On the bridge of the destroyer Akatsuki, Lieutenant Commander Tomiji Koyanagi stood beside the ship's captain, watching the darkness ahead. He had once heard an American officer captured at Wake Island describe the new radar systems. He had said they could see for miles, even in total darkness. Koyanagi had laughed. Then why, he had asked through a translator, did you not see us coming? The American had no answer. The interrogation moved on. But now, as Akatsuki knifed through the Black Pacific, Koyanagi felt a prickling unease. The sea was too quiet, the air too still. And then, at 1:41 a.m., the world caught fire.
The Americans opened up at point-blank range, 4,000 yards. Star shells burst overhead, turning night into day, and the sea exploded with muzzle flashes and tracer fire. The Japanese fleet reeled in confusion. How had the Americans found them? How had they closed to such a suicidal range without being detected? Abe's lookouts, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had seen nothing. But Helena's radar had tracked every movement, every turn, feeding firing solutions to American guns that spoke in thunder. Akatsuki took the first hits. 8-inch shells from the cruiser San Francisco tore through her superstructure, detonating ammunition stores and shearing her forward turret clean off. She burned like a torch, lighting up the chaos as other ships collided, fired wildly, and died. Hiei, the pride of Abe's fleet, was pummeled by at least 50 shells. Her steering gear failed. Her bridge was shattered. By dawn, she would be a floating wreck, scuttled by her own crew to avoid capture. 13 American and Japanese ships would be sunk or crippled in the 18-minute melee that history would call the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It was the most confused, vicious surface action of the Pacific War. And radar had delivered the Americans to the killing ground. The realization spread slowly through the Imperial Navy, like rot through timber. After Guadalcanal, after subsequent battles off Samar and Leyte Gulf, Japanese officers began requesting radar installations with desperate urgency. But it was too late. Japan's industrial base could not produce the systems in quantity. Trained operators did not exist. Doctrine had not evolved. American destroyers and cruisers, guided by radar, hunted Japanese convoys in the dark, like wolves tracking deer by scent. Submarines surfaced at night, confident that their radar would detect approaching escorts before they themselves were seen. Aircraft carriers launched night fighters equipped with airborne intercept radar, swatting Japanese bombers from the sky before they ever glimpsed their targets. The Japanese Navy, which had mocked radar as a coward's tool, found itself fighting blind. Veteran captains who had spent decades perfecting their night vision stood helpless on their bridges, staring into darkness that revealed nothing, while American guns tracked them with inhuman precision. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was an ideological collapse. The samurai spirit, cultivated through 1,000 years of warrior tradition, could not see through steel. Bushido could not defeat physics. One captured officer, interviewed after the war, described the psychological shock. "We believed our eyes were superior," he said. "We believed our training made us invincible at night. But the Americans had machines that saw farther, faster, and without error. It was as if they fought with the eyes of a god." The symbolic weight of that admission cannot be overstated. Radar represented everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had been taught to distrust: technology over spirit, pragmatism over tradition, collective industrial power over individual warrior excellence. American sailors did not need to train their eyes in darkness for years. They simply turned on a machine.
And that machine, a glowing screen in a darkened combat information center, became the single most revolutionary tool of naval warfare since the invention of the cannon. There was a sound that haunted Japanese sailors in the final years of the war, the low, mechanical hum of American radar sets cycling through their sweeps. It was a sound many never consciously heard, drowned beneath the roar of engines and the crash of waves. But it was always there, invisible and patient, the purring breath of a predator circling in the dark. On moonless nights, when Japanese destroyers crept along the coasts of New Guinea or the Philippines, trying to resupply beleaguered garrisons, that sound marked them for death. They would see nothing, no muzzle flash, no silhouette, until the first salvo arrived, impossibly accurate, and the sea turned to flame. For the Americans, radar was not merely a tactical advantage, it was an expression of a broader philosophy, one rooted in industrial abundance and democratic pragmatism. The United States did not expect its sailors to be samurai. It expected them to be competent, adaptable, and supported by the best tools that science and industry could provide. If a machine could do a job better than a man, then the machine would do the job, and the man would be free to think, to adapt, to survive. This was the American way of war, not the perfection of the individual warrior, but the overwhelming application of technological and industrial power. Japanese doctrine had prepared its sailors to die gloriously. American doctrine prepared its sailors to win and go home. The contrast was never more stark in the destroyer actions off the Solomon Islands. Japanese destroyers, the famed Tokyo Express runs, relied on speed, audacity, and intimate knowledge of local waters. Their crews were superbly trained, their captains bold to the point of recklessness, and for a time they succeeded. But as radar nets tightened, those high-speed runs became suicide missions. Destroyers that once ghosted through the darkness undetected now found themselves bracketed by shell fire from ships they never saw. Captains who executed flawless night attacks for months suddenly died in explosions they never understood. And still the orders came from Tokyo. Trust your training, trust your spirit, close with the enemy, and fight. Radar was never mentioned. To acknowledge it would be to admit that the entire foundation of Japanese naval doctrine was obsolete.
The men who operated American radar sets were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were technicians, young sailors hunched over glowing screens in cramped compartments, tracking blips and calling out ranges in calm, clipped voices. They did not see the enemy ships they hunted. They did not see the fires they caused or the men who burned. They saw only light on a screen, abstract and clean, and they translated that light into death with mechanical precision. But they understood in their own way what they had been given. Radar was not just a machine, it was a gift of sight, a way to pull back the curtain of night and see the world as it truly was. And in the hands of a navy that embraced pragmatism over tradition, that gift became a weapon of unimaginable power. After the war, when historians sifted through the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy, they found training manuals that had never been updated, doctrine that still emphasized visual spotting and manual range finding, captain's logs filled with contemptuous references to American reliance on machines. They found, too, the wreckage of ships that had died in the dark, hulls torn open by shells fired from enemies they never saw. The evidence was overwhelming. The Imperial Navy had lost the Pacific War not because its sailors lacked courage, but because its leaders had refused to accept that courage alone was no longer enough. One American radar technician, interviewed decades later, remembered the night his destroyer sank a Japanese cruiser off Kolombangara. He never saw the ship. He only saw the blip on his screen moving steadily across the grid. He called out the range, the guns fired, the blip stopped moving. Later, he learned that over 300 men had died in the water that night, clinging to wreckage in the oil-slicked darkness. He said he felt nothing at the time. It was only years later, when he understood what radar had done, how it had made killing so impersonal, so distant, that he felt the weight of it. But he also understood the alternative. Without radar, it would have been American ships burning in the dark, American sailors drowning in the oil. The machine had saved his life by taking theirs, and in the cold arithmetic of war, that was enough. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its great battleships were sunk or trapped in port, starved of fuel. Its carriers were gone. Its destroyers and cruisers, the last remnants of a once mighty fleet, hunted desperately for targets they could no longer find. American submarines, guided by radar, prowled the sea lanes with impunity. American aircraft, vectored by radar-equipped ships, struck with surgical precision. The night, once the domain of Japanese naval mastery, had become a killing field. And the captains who had mocked radar, who had trusted their eyes and their spirit above all else, were dead, or captured, or silent. There is a photograph taken in September 1945 aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officers stand in stiff rows, signing the instruments of surrender. Their faces are blank, carved from stone. Behind them, on the deck of the Missouri, stands an array of American technology, radar antennas bristling from the superstructure, fire control directors studded with electronic eyes, radio masts reaching towards the sky. The photograph is not subtle. It is a statement. This is why we won. Not because we were braver, not because we trained harder, but because we built better. We adapted faster, and we trusted our machines to do what men alone could not. The lesson of radar was not lost on the post-war world. Every navy on Earth would embrace it. Every captain would learn to read the glowing screens that had once been dismissed as toys. The age of the warrior, the samurai, the individual hero would give way to the age of systems, networks, and technological integration. War would become more impersonal, more abstract, more dependent on machines that saw and thought and killed without emotion. But on that night in November 1942, in the black waters off Guadalcanal, all that was yet unclear. All that mattered was the sudden, terrible revelation. The darkness was no longer safe. The night could be conquered. And the captains who trusted their eyes, who had mocked the machines, had sailed blind into their own destruction. There is a small museum in Yokosuka, Japan, where relics of the Imperial Navy are preserved under glass. Among the uniforms and medals and faded photographs, there is a ship's compass, salvaged from the wreck of a destroyer sunk in 1943. The brass is tarnished, the glass cracked, but the needle still swings true. It points north, as it always has, as it always will. But north is not enough. Direction is not enough. Courage is not enough. The Pacific War taught the world a brutal truth. In modern combat, the side that sees first, strikes first, wins. Radar was not the only reason the Allies triumphed, but it was the reason the darkness no longer belonged to the brave. It belonged to the prepared, to those who understood that the future of warfare lay not in the perfection of the warrior, but in the perfection of the system, the integration of man and machine, the marriage of courage and technology.
The Japanese captains who mocked radar did so because they believed in a world where spirit trumped steel, where tradition outlasted innovation, where the warrior's eye was the ultimate weapon. They were wrong, and the sea swallowed them whole. But their mistake was not unique. Throughout history, armies and navies have clung to the old ways, have mocked the new tools, have trusted in the eternal truths of combat, only to find that truth in war is written by the victors, and the victors are those who adapt. Radar did not win the war, men did. But radar gave those men the one thing that no amount of training or courage could provide, the ability to see the enemy before the enemy saw them. And in the darkness of the Pacific, on moonless nights where the sea and sky merged into one black void, that ability was the difference between life and death, between victory and oblivion. The captains who mocked it learned that lesson too late. Their ships rest now on the ocean floor, silent monuments to the cost of arrogance, and above them the waves roll on, indifferent and eternal, while the stars, those same stars that Japanese lookouts once strained to see by, shine down on a world forever changed by the invisible eyes that learned to pierce the dark.